Hello everyone, I'm Swati Bharadwaj, and in this video I'll be talking about malignancies of the endometrium. From this lecture you'll be able to learn about different types of endometrial cancers and understand how they arise and their pathophysiologic pathways. We'll also cover the different molecular subtypes of endometrial cancers according to the new WHO 2020 classification. We'll learn how to identify true lymphovascular invasion and distinguish it from pseudo-invasion, and also learn about the common endometrial stromal tumors. So the uterine wall is composed of endometrium and myometrium. The endometrium itself, in turn, is comprised of endometrial glands and endometrial stroma. The tumors that arise from endometrial glands are epithelial tumors and are therefore known as carcinomas. The ones that arise from endometrial stroma are mesenchymal tumors and are therefore known as sarcomas or endometrial stromal tumors. In September 2020, WHO released its sixth edition of Tumors of the Female Genital Tract. The major changes in endometrial epithelial tumors are in the endometrial adenocarcinoma category, and it has been reclassified. Previously, it was classified only on a morphologic basis as secretory type, villogandular, or with squamous differentiation. However, now it's classified on a molecular basis as Paul E ultramutated endometrial carcinoma, mismatch repair deficient endometrial carcinoma, P53 mutant type, and no specific molecular profile. Other than these, in the mucinous carcinoma category, an identifier of intestinal type has been added. Additionally, the category of neuroendocrine carcinoma has been removed from endometrial epithelial tumors and has been placed in a separate section altogether, because it has been reclassified to be more uniform with the classification of neuroendocrine tumors elsewhere in the body. Then there are tumor-like lesions like endometrial polyp, endometrial metaplasia, and area-stellar reaction. We'll also cover mesenchymal tumors only specific to the endometrium. So we'll cover endometrial stromal tumors, endometrial stromal nodule, endometrial stromal sarcomas, low grade and high grade. So we'll start off with tumors that arise from endometrial glands. Now, what are the precursor lesions from which endometrial carcinomas arise? These are basically hyperplasias of the endometrium, which are classified as endometrial hyperplasia without atypia and endometrial hyperplasia with atypia, or atypical hyperplasia. Now, when we mean hyperplasia, we refer to an increase in number of endometrial glands. Therefore, both these entities will show the presence of crowded glands. However, in endometrial hyperplasia without atypia, you see an increased number of glands, but with variable ratios of gland to stroma. On the other hand, atypical hyperplasia shows crowded glands with an increase in gland to stroma ratio. In hyperplasia without atypia, the glands are usually tubular. They may show branching, they may be cystically dilated, but they are always lined by a simple epithelium. On the other hand, in atypical hyperplasia, there is some degree of architectural or and cytologic atypia present, which is what defines the lesion. And in endometrial hyperplasia without atypia, if you get a specimen, the lesion is distributed across the tissue or throughout the entire submitted tissue or specimen. So there's a uniform distribution. On the other hand, atypical hyperplasia is a localized lesion. So you'll see a localized area of atypia that is usually distinct from the surrounding epithelium. Now, the reason lies in the fact that these two are pathogenetically different entities. So endometrial hyperplasia without atypia can be considered like any hyperplasia elsewhere. So it's like a cellular adaptation. So if you have a greater growth signal, the cell responds by multiplying more. And that's exactly what's happening here, which is why it affects the entire endometrial field, because the prolonged unopposed estrogen acts on the entire endometrial surface, resulting in uniform hyperplasia. On the other hand, atypical hyperplasia is more like a clonal or a neoplastic process. So you see clonal expansion of mutated glands, which is why it's always localized, at least to begin with. And thereafter, it may expand to involve the entire endometrial compartment. And since this is also a clonal process, it shares many mutations with endometrioid endometrial carcinoma. Now, since they are distinct entities in their pathogenesis, their prognosis also varies. Endometrial hyperplasia without atypia has about 3 to 4 times increased risk of endometrial carcinoma, and it progresses to well-differentiated endometrial carcinoma in 1 to 3% of women. On the other hand, atypical hyperplasia, since it's a clonal process already, so its path to malignancy is easier and shorter, That is why in atypical hyperplasia, there's a 45-fold risk of development of endometrial carcinoma. In fact, 1/4 to 1/3 of women with this entity will develop endometrial carcinoma within 1 year of follow-up. So now we'll come to the various morphological types of endometrial cancers. These include endometrioid carcinoma, serous carcinoma, clear cell adenocarcinoma, carcinoma undifferentiated type, mixed cell adenocarcinoma, mesonephric type, squamous cell carcinoma, and mucinous carcinoma of intestinal type, mesonephric-like adenocarcinoma, and carcinosarcoma. So we'll start our discussion. We'll cover only the more common entities out of all of these, and we'll start our discussion with endometrioid carcinoma. Now, traditionally, endometrioid adenocarcinoma has been classified into two types, that is type 1 and type 2. These are the two broad pathogenetic types. Type 1 tumors are low-grade tumors. They commonly are, their pathogenesis is driven by estrogen, and they're commonly of the endometrioid type. They are clinically indolent neoplasms. On the other hand, type 2 tumors are high-grade tumors, and their pathogenesis is usually unrelated to estrogen exposure. Their morphologic type is non-endometrioid, so it is clear cell or serous type usually, and they are clinically aggressive neoplasms. Now, it has been found out that the pathogenesis of endometrioid carcinoma is not actually that simple, and we cannot broadly categorize these two entities because there is significant overlap at clinical, pathological, and molecular level, which was why the WHO introduced another histomorphologic classification, histomolecular classification, which is as follows. So the first category in this classification is POL-E ultra-mutated endometrial carcinoma. Now, POL-E is a gene that encodes for the epsilon subunit of DNA polymerase. It's actually the epsilon catalytic subunit of DNA polymerase enzyme. In this category of tumors, there are more than 100 mutations per megabases of DNA in this gene. And these tumors are often high-grade with an ambiguous morphology. They have scattered tumor giant cells and prominent tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. We can diagnose these mutations by next-generation sequencing, Sanger sequencing, or hotspot analysis. These tumors tend to present at a younger age overall and have an excellent prognosis despite being high-grade. The next category is of mismatch repair deficient endometrial carcinomas. Now, these are also high-grade tumors. They also have prominent tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, but their histotype is commonly of mucinous type, and they tend to show a MELF pattern of invasion. MELF stands for microcystic, elongated, and fragmented, and we will cover this type of invasion later in the lecture. They're also more likely to show lymphovascular space invasion. We can detect this kind of deficiencies by performing immunohistochemistry for mismatch repair proteins, or by conducting a microsatellite instability genetic assay, or by next generation sequencing. Now, since they do show microsatellite instability, they are associated with another syndrome that is associated with microsatellite instability, that's Lynch syndrome. Overall, these tumors have an intermediate prognosis. The third category is that of p53 mutant carcinomas. So they are also mostly high grade with diffuse cytonuclear atypia. They may have glandular or solid patterns. They show a mutant type of p53 immunohistochemical staining, which means that you'll either find greater than 80% of the tumor cell nuclei showing positive staining for p53, or no staining at all, which is called a null pattern of staining, but both of them are considered to be mutant p53. These tumors present at advanced stages and have a poor prognosis. No specific molecular profile category, that is the fourth category, that shows less than 10 mutations per megabasis, and these tumors are microsatellite stable, otherwise they would fall into the second category. They are mostly low-grade tumors with frequent squamous differentiation, and usually they do not show tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. Now, since it's a no specific molecular profile, these tumors lack mismatch repair deficiency. So they are mismatch repair proficient, p53 wild type, and they do not have the pathogenic POL-E mutation. They are likely to occur in women with a higher body mass index and have intermediate to excellent prognosis. The WHO also described an algorithm on the steps in which the different genetic tests should be carried out. So if we see an endometrial cancer, histological subtype independent, So no matter what histological subtype you see, you need to put it in a different molecular category. The first step to be performed is the Pol E status. And if we find there is Pol E pathogenic mutation present, then the integrated diagnosis or the histomolecular category is Pol E ultra mutated endometrial cancer. If, however, Pol E is wild type or non-pathogenic, then the second genetic test to be carried out is to look for mismatch repair status. And if we find mismatch repair deficiency, then it's obviously the second category, that is mismatch repair deficient endometrial carcinoma. If that also is proficient, then the third step is to go for P53 staining. And if we find a mutant type of P53 staining, then it is categorized as P53 mutated endometrial carcinoma. If none of these three are detected, then it's the fourth category, that is no specific molecular profile. Now, coming to endometrioid endometrial carcinomas, these tumors are driven by an estrogen-related mechanism. So they are associated with prolonged unopposed estrogen exposure. Consequently, all the conditions that would result in such type of exposure are risk factors for the development of endometrioid endometrial carcinomas. And these conditions include early menarche, late menopause, nulliparity, obesity, tamoxifen, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and ovarian tumors that produce estrogen, for example, granulosa subtumors. There are two important syndromes associated with endometrioid endometrial carcinomas. These are Lynch syndrome and Cowden syndrome. Now, there are certain peculiarities of endometrioid carcinomas that are associated with Lynch syndrome. They tend to occur in relatively younger age group as compared to sporadic tumors, and they are associated, they are more likely to occur in women with a lower BMI as compared to sporadic tumors. So they obviously have an endometrioid histotype. They're more likely to show a prominent infiltration by lymphocytes. They're also more likely to show peritumoral as well as intratumoral lymphocytes. Lynch syndrome associated tumors are also known to show dedifferentiation or an undifferentiated histotype. Now, this is the common histological appearance of endometrioid carcinoma. So you see that there's an increased gland to stroma ratio. The glands show a complex architecture. There is stratification of nuclei, and the nuclei become round instead of the normal oval shape of the proliferating endometrium. If you look at the gland to lumen junction, so there's a sharp demarcation between the gland and the lumen. They're more likely to show a squamous morule formation. This does not carry any specific clinical significance, but it is important to note that this area is not to be counted as a solid area when we are trying to determine the percentage for FIGO grading system. Now, so both endometrial atypical hyperplasia as well as endometrial carcinoma show atypia and complex architecture. Then how do we differentiate the two? The only way to differentiate is to determine the presence of invasion. Now, if the glands are invading into the stroma, you may see a lack of stroma altogether. So there may be loss of intervening stroma. And another thing that happens when the glands invade the stroma is that the stroma reacts to it. So you see a desmoplastic reaction. And the infiltrating glands are more likely to show a complex architecture. So that's how you determine invasion. Now, after deciding whether or not invasion is present, we also need to determine the depth of invasion of tumor into the myometrium. This is a very good article that describes how to determine the depth of invasion. I have taken this figure from the article. So the first step is to find out a normal endomyometrial junction. The area to look for a normal endomyometrial junction should show a smooth contour, and microscopically you should see normal endometrial stromal cells lying adjacent to myometrial cells. So that becomes your upper limit, the normal endomyometrial junction. And then you take the deepest point of invasion of the tumor, that's the depth of invasion, and divide it by the myometrial thickness that is again measured from the endomyometrial junction to the serosal layer. Now, determining this depth of invasion is very simple when the tumor is invading in direct extension from the surface, but sometimes there may be a discontinuous focus of invasion. In that case, it is important to determine whether this discontinuous focus is actually an invading focus Or is it a colonization of adenomyosis by the tumor? Uh, an actual invading focus of tumor is more likely to show these spiculated edges. In these cases, you measure from the endomyometrial junction to the deepest point of the spiculated edge of the invading focus. When we don't see an endomyometrial junction directly, then you draw a plane from the nearest endomyometrial junction and measure the depth of invasion from that. In figure E, you can see a tumor that arises in a focus of adenomyosis. So the smooth contoured area is adenomyosis, and the spiculated area is a tumor that's arising from the adenomyosis and invading deeper from that. In this particular case, in order to measure the depth of invasion, you take the deepest point of the normal adenomyosis and measure the depth from here to the deepest point of invasion. So this becomes our depth of invasion, which is to be divided by the total myometrial thickness. So this is how you determine the percentage of myometrial invasion in endometrial carcinomas. Now, once you're finished with that, we also need to identify whether the tumor is invading into the blood vessels. So whether or not there is a vascular invasion. Sometimes we may see tumor cells in an apparent vascular space, and we need to decide whether it's a real invasion or artifactual invasion. In true invasion, tumor cells, the invading focus is comprised entirely of tumor cells, and they are adherent to the blood vessel wall or to the endothelial cells. And there are numerous causes and scenarios for a pseudo invasion or something that may look like a vascular invasion. Can be artifactual, or they can be morphologic mimics of invasion. Artifactual spaces are more common when the tumor is friable or fragmented, or by surgical techniques like uterine manipulators. So here the tumor is actually inside a blood vessel, but it is not invasion of the blood vessel by the tumor. It's just because the tumor is fragmented and friable that it gets displaced. Or you use a surgical technique like a uterine manipulator that displaces the tumor cells, but it is not true invasion. Then there are certain morphologic mimics of vascular invasion. These include a microcystic, elongated, and fragmented pattern of invasion, intravenous leiomyomatosis, intravascular menses or adenomyosis or endometriosis. So we look at these situations now. The microcystic, elongated, and fragmented pattern of invasion is when you see tumor cells in an apparent vascular space. And the only way to determine whether or not this is a true blood vessel is by performing immunohistochemical staining. So we do markers for endothelial cells or vascular markers like FLI1, photoplanin, and or CD31. And if these cells stain positive, then it's true invasion. Now, as I mentioned, there may be artifactual lymphovascular invasion because of mechanical displacement of tumor cells. That is more likely to be seen when the tumor itself is exophytic, papillary, or poorly fixed, or by mechanical trauma due to a uterine manipulator. This artifactual displacement can also occur on the grossing table. So this is knife displacement during dissection, or because of increased intrauterine pressure due to the manipulator, the tumor cells get pushed into the blood vessels. Now, how do you distinguish them? So clues that point towards presence of an artifact are when we find both neoplastic as well as non-neoplastic endometrium, which is often crushed and distorted, and we may even see fragments of stroma. Now, I have taken these figures from this article for evaluation of vascular space involvement, and we look at them one by one to determine whether it's true or pseudo invasion. I've also summarized the points of differences between the two from this article. So true lymphovascular invasion shows cohesive tumor clusters with altered tumor cell cytology. They usually do not have admixed inflammatory cells. They go up to the deeper lymphatics, where they have nearby large blood vessels and nearby lymphoid aggregates are also commonly seen. On the other hand, pseudo-invasion, in this the tumor cells are disaggregated and they resemble the main tumor because it's just fragments of the main tumor that have been pushed into the blood vessels. They tend to show more admixed inflammatory cells, and they only go up to the superficial lymphatics with no nearby large blood vessels or no nearby lymphoid aggregates. We may, however, see a nearby retraction artifact. On the left, we see tumor cells in a space which is surrounded by a lymphoid aggregate. The tumor cells are cohesive, so this is more likely to be true invasion. On the right, we see tumor cells in spaces. The tumor cells are cohesive, and there's a nearby large, thick-walled blood vessel. So this is also more likely to be true invasion. In this figure, we see tumor cells in spaces. These are lymphatic spaces, but they're only superficial, and they're not going into the deeper lymphatics. So this is a clue pointing towards artifactual displacement of tumor cells. In these figures, we see discohesive tumor cells with admixed inflammatory cells and no nearby large blood vessels. So this is more likely to be pseudo-invasion. So once we determine that it's actually artifactual invasion, now how do we report it? We first need to confirm the type of surgical procedure, and then it is reported as floating tumor cells within vascular spaces cannot exclude mechanical artifact. Sometimes we may see floating tumor cells even in the fallopian tube. And if we do see that, we need not upstage the tumor because they may have been mechanically displaced, and this fact needs to be communicated clearly to the surgeon. On the other hand, if you determine that it is actually true lymphovascular invasion, then how do we report it? Then we need to grade it or quantify it. For quantification, less than 5 blood vessel involvement is termed as focal lymphovascular invasion. And if 5 or more vessels are involved, it is termed extensive lymphovascular invasion. It is important to make this distinction because it may carry prognostic significance. Now, coming to histological grading of endometrioid carcinomas. Now, we know that in all organ systems, histological grading is based on the degree of differentiation. So in endometrial carcinomas or endometrioid adenocarcinomas, as the tumor becomes more poorly differentiated, it tends to become more solid. So we determine the grading on the basis of the percentage of solid areas, which are non-glandular and non-squamous. If we see less than 5% of solid non-glandular non-squamous areas, it is a grade 1 tumor. 6 to 50% of these areas are termed as grade 2, and greater than 50% is grade 3. In addition to that, if we see severe cytologic atypia in greater than 50% of the cells, then that increases the grade by 1 level. Overall, grades 1 and 2 are lumped together as low grade, and grade 3 is high grade. Now, the immunohistochemical markers for endometrioid adenocarcinomas. Low-grade endometrioid adenocarcinomas are positive for ER and PR. Usually, they show diffuse and strong staining, and they show patchy staining for P16, which can be used as a distinguishing feature for differentiating them from endocervical adenocarcinomas, which are negative for ER and PR and show diffuse P16 staining. Higher grade endometrioid adenocarcinomas usually lack ER/PR, and they also show loss of immunostaining for ARID1A, P10, and mismatch repair proteins. Now, a common scenario is that we may see tumor cells in both endometrial curettage as well as endocervical curettage. Then it's important to determine where are the tumor cells coming from, that is whether it's endometrial carcinoma or endocervical adenocarcinoma. The only way to do that is by utilizing immunohistochemistry. There's a classic 4-marker panel comprising of ER, Vimentin, monoclonal CEA, and P16 that has a greater than 97% specificity. So if we utilize this panel of monoclonal CEA, Vimentin, P16, and ER, endocervical tumors are positive for monoclonal CEA and also diffusely and strongly positive for P16. Endometrial tumors, on the other hand, are negative for CEA, positive for Vimentin, show focal or patchy staining for P16. There may be certain squamoid areas, they may show some staining, but they are diffusely positive for ER. There are some other potential markers which are not so widely used. For example, we know that endocervical carcinomas, there's a role of HPV in the pathogenesis. So we can utilize that. High-risk HPV detection within the tumor tissue by in situ hybridization or other molecular methods is also definitive for the identification of endocervical adenocarcinoma. There are other less commonly used markers as well, like MUC5AC, that's negative in normal endometrial glands and is positive in normal endocervical glands. It shows strong reactivity in several cases of endocervical adenocarcinoma, but sometimes it is also being shown to be focally positive in endometrioid carcinomas. N-cadherin is another marker that's positive in normal endometrial glands as well as endometrioid adenocarcinoma, but it is negative in most normal endocervical glands and endocervical adenocarcinoma. The pitfalls in immunohistochemistry are that it's only useful for well-differentiated tumors because as the tumors become more undifferentiated, they tend to lose immunoreactivity for most proteins. Some endometrioid carcinomas are diffusely P16 positive. Uterine serous carcinoma may be diffusely P16 positive. And mucinous carcinoma of the endometrium tends to show an inconsistent immunophenotype. So it's always better to use a panel rather than single markers. The next morphology category of endometrial cancer is serous carcinoma. Serous carcinomas are more common in African American patients. There's usually a history of pelvic irradiation, tamoxifen use, or breast cancer, and they're less likely to be associated with obesity as against endometrioid adenocarcinomas. These tumors occur in multiparous women, which is also to be distinguished from endometrioid adenocarcinomas that are more common in nulliparous women. Etiologically, there's a role of P53 mutation. They may also show alterations of PI3K, AKT, mTOR, MAP kinase pathway. There's possible association with BRCA1 or 2 mutations as well. Now, a common scenario in which serous carcinomas arise grossly is that they arise in a background of atrophic endometrium. So they arise on the surface of an endometrial polyp in a background of atrophic endometrium. In the Cancer Genomic Atlas cohort, all serous carcinomas fall in the copy number high subgroup. So the Cancer Genomic Atlas cohort determined 4 different categories of mutations in endometrial carcinomas, that is Pol E mutation, microsatellite instability or MMR, copy number high and copy number low. Amongst these, all serous carcinomas show a copy number high subtype. Histologically, they show a papillary architecture, and the distinct feature is that the papillae in serous carcinoma have a hierarchical branching. So what do I mean by hierarchical branching? So just like the branches of a tree, when you move further away from the trunk, the branches tend to become smaller. Similarly here, as we move away from the main trunk, the branches tend to become, or the papillae tend to become smaller. Cytologically, they have high-grade features. Their nuclei may be angulated, and they show prominent, almost red nucleoli that is enlarged. Immunohistochemically, the distinct feature is staining for P53. So they show a mutant type of P53 staining, which I previously mentioned is either greater than 80% nuclear staining or no staining at all. They may show diffuse staining for P16, IMP3, and HMGA2, but they are variably positive for ER and PR. HER2 amplification is seen in 30% of serous carcinomas, and that can be used for therapy. That's a therapeutic target. The next morphologic phenotype is clear cell carcinoma. Clear cell carcinomas account for less than 10% of all endometrial carcinomas. They tend to occur in older women, that is mid to late 7 decades, and 50 to 60% tumors present at an early stage. They may have an interesting clinical feature, that is, they may show increased risk of venous thromboembolic events that is not seen in other endometrial carcinomas. There is no known histotype specific mutation, unlike serous carcinoma where P53 is strongly associated and in fact utilized for detection of those tumors. But for clear cell, there are significant overlapping mutations with other types, and clear cell themselves show different mutations like TP53, PIK3CA, ARID1A, KRAS, etc. And any of the 4 molecular subtypes of the Cancer Genomic Atlas may be seen in clear cell carcinoma, but most common is no specific molecular profile. Histologically, clear cell carcinoma may show a solid pattern or a papillary pattern. Solid is more likely and more common than papillary. If they do show a papillary pattern, then the papillae are short, rounded with hyalinized stroma, and the cells have a cuboidal to polygonal shape. The cytoplasm of the cells may be clear to eosinophilic, and they may show hobnailing. But the important point to note is that you may not see a clear cytoplasm always. So presence of a clear cytoplasm is not a required feature for diagnosis of clear cell carcinoma. Similarly, hobnailing is also not a required feature for diagnosis of a clear cell carcinoma. And what are the features that you do not see in clear cell carcinomas? These are tall columnar cells, abundant stratification, intraglandular tufting, or detached budding. And if we see any of these features, then we must in fact reconsider the diagnosis of clear cell carcinoma. These tumors have a relatively poor prognosis. So the 5-year survival rate is 55 to 78%, but an advanced stage and advanced age is associated with even poorer prognosis. So it's the histology of a clear cell carcinoma. On the bottom right of the figure, we can see clear cells, but on the top right, the cells have scant eosinophilic cytoplasm. So clearing of the cytoplasm, as I mentioned, is not a required feature. We may see hobnailing focally, and the tumor cells are arranged in a solid pattern here, but papillary pattern here. Important immunohistochemical markers are HNF1b, NAPSIN-A, and AMACAR. In fact, HNF1b and NAPSIN-A are very specific for the diagnosis of clear cell carcinomas. Morphologically, they may a benign entity that may look very similar is Ehlers-Danlos reaction. So how do you distinguish the two? Ehlers-Danlos reaction is more likely to be seen in younger females. There's an associated pregnancy. Histologically, Ehlers-Danlos reaction is localized, and the cells are even, in fact, much more atypical than the cells of clear cell carcinoma. They tend to have larger nuclei, and the nuclei have smudged chromatin, but they lack mitosis and they lack invasion. So that is how you distinguish Ehlers-Danlos reaction from clear cell carcinoma. The next category is undifferentiated carcinomas and dedifferentiated carcinomas. So as the name suggests, in undifferentiated carcinoma, there is no overt cell lineage differentiation. And dedifferentiated carcinomas, on the other hand, show an undifferentiated component along with a differentiated component. These tumors are seen in perimenopausal or postmenopausal females with a mean age of 55 years. And endometrial carcinomas with mismatch repair deficiency are the most likely to dedifferentiate, followed by copy number low, POL-E mutated or TP53 mutated carcinomas. Activating PI3K mutations are seen in more than one half of these patients, and inactivating mutations in SWI, SNF are seen in 2/3 dedifferentiated and one half of undifferentiated carcinomas. There is loss of SMARCA4, SMARCB1, ARID1A, and ARID1B. Since these tumors are undifferentiated or dedifferentiated, they lose some of their immunohistochemical staining or markers. So they tend to show lost keratin expression or reduced keratin expression, but they are more likely to be positive for EMA or CK818. They may be positive for vimentin, but negative for ER, PR, and E-cadherin. PAX8 is also usually negative or patchy because the tumors are dedifferentiated or undifferentiated. Sometimes they may show focal neuroendocrine marker expression like chromogranin or synaptophysin, but it has to be less than 10%. Otherwise, you have to consider a possibility of true neuroendocrine carcinoma. Prognostically, these are highly aggressive neoplasms and recur in 55 to 95% of cases. SWI or SNF deficient tumors are more aggressive than SWI or SNF proficient tumors and show more recurrence. Mixed carcinomas are defined as endometrial carcinomas with at least two spatially distinct histological types, out of which at least one component is serous type or clear cell type, and that has to be identified by histology and immunohistochemistry. So in simple words, when you see two different types of endometrial carcinomas histologically, out of which at least one is serous or clear cell, then you call it a mixed carcinoma. But identification of that serous or clear cell has to be done by histology and immunohistochemistry. Now, what percentage of serous or clear cell do you need to make this diagnosis? Actually, any percentage of high-grade carcinoma can be confidently demonstrated. That is with IHC, is sufficient to label the tumor as mixed endometrial carcinoma. These tumors are always graded as high-grade, irrespective of the relative percentages of serous or clear cell component. Now, the pathogenesis of mixed carcinoma, there are multiple theories that have been hypothesized, one of which is the collision theory. This theory suggests that there are two different cell lines in the beginning. So let's say there's an endometrial type and any type 2, clear cell or serous cell, and these tumors collide as they are growing. Another theory is morphologic mimicry, in which the tumor starts out as a single tumor type, but there is focal divergent morphology mimicking a second tumor type that results in a mixed carcinoma. More recent articles are pointing towards clonality of both the tumor components in a mixed carcinoma. So what is more likely is that there's a single tumor type, a single cell clone that undergoes a new mutation to acquire a second type of phenotype. So that's a mixed carcinoma because of secondary mutation. The ASGIP recommendations for diagnosis of mixed carcinoma of the endometrium say that we have to list each type of tumor, the percent of overall tumor composed of each type, and the grade of the endometrioid component. And a second observer and/or immunohistochemistry is advised to confirm the presence of the component of serous carcinoma and/or clear cell carcinoma. Also, the overall grade of the tumor is always high grade or grade 3 by definition, as I previously mentioned. Now, coming to carcinosarcomas, they account for 5% of all uterine malignancies and have almost the same risk factors as endometrial carcinomas. Etiologically, tamoxifen use is seen in about 6% of women with carcinosarcomas. In fact, they arise as a long-term complication of pelvic irradiation in a number of cases. And how do these tumors arise, or what's the pathogenesis? Even though in the beginning, it was unknown how two different components like carcinomas and sarcomas are occurring together, but now it's well established by numerous articles that both carcinoma and sarcoma have the same genetic mutations, because of which now it is known that this tumor occurs because of transdifferentiation or epithelial to mesenchymal transition of the carcinomatous component to the sarcomatous component. So that's the origin of carcinosarcomas. If we were to classify them according to the genetic mutations, 60 to 78% of carcinosarcomas belong to the copy number high molecular subgroup, 22 to 38% fall in the copy number low subgroup, and less than 5% show POL-E mutations. Histologically, we see in this figure, we see in the center, this area, that's the carcinomatous component. It's a high-grade carcinoma. You can see angulated nuclei and prominent nucleoli, so serous type. And in the background, we see stroma is also malignant. So there are bizarre atypical cells in the stroma as well. So there is occurrence of carcinoma along with the sarcoma. The sarcomatous component may show heterologous differentiation. For example, in this figure, we can see rhabdomyoblasts with abundant eosinophilic cytoplasm. We can even see striations that are suggestive of skeletal muscle differentiation. This is an example of heterologous differentiation seen in carcinosarcomas. These tumors have a poor prognosis. Stage 1 to 2 tumors have 5-year survival rate of 60%. Stage 3 tumors show a 25% survival, and the survival in stage 4 tumors is just 10%. Other prognostic factors, the factors that predict a poor prognosis include size greater than 5 centimeters, myometrial invasion greater than 50%, presence of lymphovascular invasion, and predominance of the sarcoma component. Serous histology is also a marker of poor prognosis, as is rhabdomyoblastic differentiation. Now we come to the second half, that is tumors that arise from endometrial stromal cells. The origin of endometrial stromal cells themselves is not definite. They are said to be derived from mesenchymal stem cells, perivascular cells, or bone marrow-derived mesenchymal stem cells with subsequent development into endometrial stromal fibroblasts. On electron microscopy, endometrial stromal cells show the spindle configuration of the nuclei and abundant and narrow microfilaments that extend to the supranuclear region. Endometrial stromal tumors account for 10% of uterine mesenchymal neoplasms and 2% of all uterine neoplasms. Out of these, endometrial stromal nodules account for 0.5% of all benign tumors of endometrium, and endometrial stromal sarcomas account for 0.2 to 1.5% of all uterine malignancies. The classification of endometrial stromal tumors has evolved and changed considerably over the years. So in the beginning, they were only classified on the basis of the mesenchymal stroma as homologous or heterologous. The current classification has been the same since the change in 2014. So the 2014 and 2020 classification is the same. There's a category of endometrial stromal nodule, endometrial stromal sarcoma low grade, high grade endometrial stromal sarcoma, and undifferentiated uterine sarcoma. So as we go from endometrial stromal nodule to undifferentiated, there is loss of differentiation and increase in ATPI. The first category is endometrial stromal nodule. Endometrial stromal nodules are seen in the age group of 23 to 86 years, but the mean age is about 50 years. 75% of the patients are premenopausal, and the average duration of symptoms before presentation or diagnosis is 2 months. Around 10% of the patients are asymptomatic. In that case, the tumors are found incidentally. If symptoms are present, they include abnormal uterine bleeding. If the bleeding is severe, the patient may develop anemia, and there may be pelvic or abdominal discomfort because of the presence of a mass. And since there's a mass, so on examination, we'll find uterine enlargement or a uterine mass. This is the typical gross appearance of an endometrial stromal nodule. So it is well demarcated, well circumscribed, and has a fleshy yellow to tan appearance. The size of these tumors can range from less than 1 centimeter to greater than 20 centimeters, but the average size is about 4 to 5 centimeters. They are intramural in location in 2/3 of the cases. 18% are polypoidal, and others are present at the junction of endomyometrium. Now, microscopically, it is a blue tumor. So if you look at the tumor at low power, we'll see a densely cellular blue tumor that resembles proliferative phase of endometrial stromal cells. So this is how it will look. Another characteristic feature is the presence of whirling around spiral arteriole-like blood vessels. You can see whirling of tumor cells here. The tumor tends to have expansile and non-infiltrative margins commonly. So this is the gross appearance of the tumor, how it's expanding into or pushing into the myometrium, but not infiltrating into it. But there is an exception to this. We may see some finger-like extensions, but they have to be less than 3 in number and less than 3 millimeters in length for us to still call it endometrial stromal nodule and not a sarcoma. So this is one single finger-like extension. Up to 3 of them and 3 millimeters length are allowed. These tumors may show focal smooth muscle differentiation, skeletal muscle differentiation, or sex cord stromal differentiation. If the degree of smooth muscle differentiation is greater than 30%, then the tumor is termed as mixed stromal smooth muscle tumor. This was an entity that was earlier called stromomyoma. If the sex cord stromal differentiation is greater than 10% of the tumor is referred to as endometrial stromal tumor with sex cord-like elements. Endometrial stromal tumors are positive for CD10, that is a marker of endometrial stroma. But is it specific for endometrial stromal nodule? Not really, because leiomyosarcomas and almost 50% of highly cellular leiomyomas also show CD10 positivity. There are other markers as well. So they are positive for ER and PR, and variably positive for SMA and H-caldesmon depending on the differentiation. The characteristic genetic marker for endometrial stromal nodule is translocation 717 that is identified in over 1/2 of the cases, including both conventional as well as variant endometrial stromal nodules. So translocation 717 results in fusion of the genes JASF1 and JJASF1 or SUS12. As the two genes fuse, it results in an oncogene that has the N-terminus part of JASF1 and C-terminus part of SUS12. And what is the function of this oncogene? Basically, it results in activation of anti-apoptotic genes. There's another translocation, that is translocation 610, which is second most common in these tumors. The next category is low-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma. Low-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma is the second most common malignant mesenchymal tumor of the uterus, occurring in the age group of 42 to 53 years. 50% of the patients are premenopausal. So the most common location is obviously the uterine corpus, but these tumors can also be seen in an extrauterine location. You can see them in the ovary, pelvis, abdominal cavity, vulva, and vagina. And that may be because of the presence of endometrial stroma in endometriosis foci. The symptoms are similar to endometrial stromal nodules, that is, abnormal bleeding or abdominal pain. The uterus is typically enlarged on examination, but tends to have an irregular contour. It can even be polypoidal. Occasionally, they present with intra-abdominal or pulmonary metastases as well. Now, the gross appearance of low-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma is very different from endometrial stromal nodule. So if you remember an endometrial stromal nodule, the tumor is well circumscribed and has a tan yellow appearance. Here, on the other hand, the tumor has a worm-like infiltration pattern into the myometrium, and the cut surface is fleshy tan to yellow. So it is ill-defined, submucosal or intramural with a worm-like penetration into the myometrium. This type of infiltration is reproduced on microscopy as well. So we see these tongue-like invasion into the myometrium. The bluish areas of the tumor invading into these pink areas, that is the myometrium. These tongue-like foci are most helpful in distinguishing this tumor from endometrial stromal nodule, which tends to be more expansive. We can see lymphovascular invasion. The mitotic activity in these tumors is variable. Typically, it's less than 3 mitotic figures per 10 high power field, but occasionally there may be as high as 10 mitoses per 10 high power fields. The tumors may show myxoid differentiation. In that case, it's called a myxoid variant. They may show elongated fascicles of spindle-shaped tumor cells, and that is known as fibroblastic or myofibroblastic variant. We can see the presence of hyaline plaques in the tumor. The hyaline plaques can form a starburst pattern as well. Sometimes low-grade endometrial stromal sarcomas can show foci of epithelial-like differentiation as well. The genetics is similar to that of endometrial stromal nodule. So we see translocation 717 in these cases as well. The other fusions that may be seen are JAS-F1, PHF1, EPC1, PHF1, MEAF6, PHF1, and others as well. The next category is that of high-grade endometrial stromal sarcomas. These tumors also present as a myopermeative uterine mass. They may show extrauterine tumor extension or extrauterine tumor deposits, but on gross appearance, they are more likely to show areas of hemorrhage and necrosis. So this is the microscopic appearance of high-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma. We can see tongue-like permeation in these tumors as well, but they lack perivascular whirling, and they show a rich and arborizing stromal capillary network that often gives rise to a vague nesting appearance to the tumor cells. About 1/2 of the tumors are biphasic, and by biphasic we mean that the tumor contains both low-grade areas and high-grade areas. Other half of the tumors show only high-grade areas. High-grade endometrial stromal sarcomas show YWHAE not M2 fusion, and the threshold for FISH positivity, that is the percentage of tumor cells that need to show this fusion for us to consider it positive, is 30%. This fusion is specific in the context of adult mesenchymal tumors and uterine tumors, but it is also seen in clear cell sarcoma of the kidney. Cyclin D1 can be used as an immunomarker, as a surrogate marker for the detection of YWHE FAM22 rearrangement. It shows 100% sensitivity and 99% specificity. So the immunohistochemical markers that can be seen in low-grade and high-grade areas of endometrial stromal sarcomas, high-grade type, are CD10, ER, and PR, are more likely to be positive in the low-grade areas, while high-grade areas show strong and diffuse staining for cyclin D1 and moderate to strong staining for c-KIT. Currently, the term high-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma is reserved for those stromal sarcomas that exhibit round cell morphology and harbor translocation 1017 rearrangement with YWHAE NUT-M2 gene fusion. The last category is undifferentiated uterine sarcomas. This is a wastebasket category that comprises a heterogeneous group of high-grade tumors that fail to fulfill the morphological and immunohistochemical criteria of translocation-positive endometrial stromal sarcomas. These tumors are large and fleshy with a destructive infiltrative growth, extensive necrosis and or hemorrhage. Histologically, they show sheets or fascicles of highly atypical cells that don't resemble the proliferative phase endometrial stroma. They commonly show lymphovascular invasion and mitotic activity is brisk, and they're commonly associated with atypical mitotic figures. So this is the histological appearance that is non-specific but with high-grade features. So high degree of nuclear pleomorphism and high mitotic rate. The tumors lack immunohistochemical staining specific for endometrial stromal tumors. So there is no CD10 negative for ER and PR, and they show lymphovascular invasion. We see CD34 positivity, but inside the tumor cells lack the staining. Undifferentiated uterine sarcomas have complex karyotypes, and they commonly show TP53 mutations. Now, if we compare the prognosis and treatment of all endometrial stromal tumors, endometrial stromal nodules are benign, so they can be treated by hysterectomy or myomectomy alone and have 100% 10-year survival rate. For all others, that is low-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma, high-grade endometrial stromal sarcoma, and undifferentiated uterine sarcoma, the treatment is total abdominal hysterectomy, bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy, combined with chemoradiotherapy. The survival rate decreases as we move from low-grade endometrial stromal sarcomas to undifferentiated type. Low-grade endometrial stromal sarcomas have 95 to 100% 10-year survival rate, which drops to 65 to 76% for high-grade tumors, while undifferentiated uterine sarcomas are very aggressive with poor prognosis. So in these tumors, death usually occurs within 3 to 5 years. Another category is of uterine tumors resembling ovarian sex cord stromal tumors. These are rare mesenchymal neoplasms, and their lineage is actually uncertain, but they are hypothesized to arise from pluripotent mesenchymal cells or endometrial stromal cells, which is why I have included it in this lecture, or displaced ovarian sex cord cells. They have morphologic resemblance to ovarian sex cord tumors, as the name suggests, and ultrastructurally, the tumor cells show both epithelial and sex cord-like differentiation. These tumors are said to have an uncertain malignant potential, but there are certain morphologic features that can point towards a possible malignant behavior of the tumor. These include the presence of necrosis or a mitotic rate greater than 2 per 10 high power fields. The common genetic fusions seen in these tumors include GREB1 CTLNB1 fusion, GREB1 NCOA12, and ESR1 NCOA23 fusions. So histologically, they show a resemblance to sex cord stromal cells. They have a polyphenotypic expression on immunohistochemistry. So they show variable positivity for sex cord markers like inhibin, calretinin, WT1, CD56, CD99, and SF1. They can even show positivity for FOXL2, melin A, epithelial markers, ER, PR, smooth muscle markers, and CD10. Overall, they are said to have a low or uncertain malignant potential, but a rhabdoid morphology may be associated with recurrence in these tumors. So that's it about all endometrial malignancies. I have covered most of the important ones. And if you have any questions or any feedback, please feel free to reach out.